right, welcome back to another episode of the TFD Performance Podcast. Not getting these out as frequently as we were, but for good reason. That's because we've been really busy with travel lately, and Dojo and I have just got back from Salt Lake City, Utah. So Dojo, thanks for coming back on.
Thanks for having me, Jordy.
Yeah, we just got back from Salt Lake City, Utah, as I just said, for UFC 278. We're working with Leon Edwards and Tyson Pedro. We keep talking about Leon because of the crazy events that happened, but we did work with Tyson as well. Tyson did really, really crazy good. I think he's kind of flying under the radar. I think his performance, was just like out of this world first round. I actually watched it back on the plane over, and I would say that is as close to a flawless performance I've seen.
Yeah, and especially after the layoff he's had as well, like it's pretty crazy to come back and do that, put someone away in the first round. Super impressive.
Yeah, Tyson's an interesting one, and I think he's a good example for like any young athletes that are listening to this of how to come back from injury properly, because Tyson did his ACL 2 years ago, and then I think it was only 2 weeks before he was due to be completely cleared, he redid his ACL. So he went 2 back-to-back ACLs. Mentally, I can't even imagine the place that put him, but he's just so tough, and he did everything the right way. When I say tough, I say mentally tough in the right way. He went and got a mental coach in Dave Neath. He started working with Dave Wood, who does integrated training that we've seen, a lot of the breath work, a lot of, the stress management. He worked with Mia Orney from Ethos Performance Australia to do all his strength conditioning rehab. And he worked with Roop, the physio as well. And he did literally everything by the book, but he did that rehab. I think it took him 2.5 years. And then all up, by the time he had his camp and booked in a fight, it was 3 years. And now he's just on this mad tear in the UFC. I can't have any more respect for someone more than Tyson just going through that. And I really do think he's going to give that light heavyweight division a real shake-up.
Yeah, no, it's going to be interesting to see. And I think like that sort of patience is super difficult to have. Like, I think everyone kind of wants to turn around as soon as possible whenever they get any sort of injury, but it just shows like taking the time to put in the work and get all the fundamentals down before you just like rush back into it can make a huge, huge difference.
And you know what the best thing I love about working with Tyson is, in all that time that he was off, he was super diligent with his weight. Like, we played around with a lot of different diets, and we kind of figured out what type of diet works for him. One stage we were doing like completely plant-based. We went to like a more of a meat-heavy type thing. And then we just kind of switched back to what our traditional performance type diet was. And we found what really works for his diet, for his body. And it's crazy, like during fight week, he cuts a bit of weight, but he does it so well because his body's in such a good metabolic state to do so, because he just has eaten so well those last 3 years when he was off. Like, that dude, the morning before weigh-ins, was eating a full buffet pancake and bacon breakfast with full maple.
Yeah.
He reckons that his opponent walked into, just happened to be in the cafe, like out of town that they went to, and walked in and kind of just went white with shock, was like, "What are you doing? Like, we got to make weight tomorrow." Like, we were, and he's like, "Relax, it's all good." But he was doing that every single day of fight week, just eating bacon, pancakes, eggs, like massive meals. And he made weight super easy, just did a little sweat out. And it's just like, again, it's just like a credit to Tyson. It's doing like everything right over those 3 years that he had off.
Yeah. I remember you telling me that he was heading into the cafe that morning to get pancakes, and I was like, no way. So I can't imagine what the opponent must have been thinking. Hey, cutting weight and then watching the other guy just smashing heaps of carbs the day before you're about to fight him. It must be pretty scary.
Yeah, mentally it would throw you off so much, just like thinking, I've got to fight this guy, especially. And I like it, right? Like, it's cool when you can have that type of athlete, because you treat them like you would every other athlete going into competition, and where you would like load them up for competition. Whereas every other combat sport athlete cutting weight is doing the complete 180 of what you would do for any other sporting context, where there's deplete. And then you've got 24 to 36 hours to try to reload them up, where Tyson is basically just carb loading that entire week. And he just comes out in round one and just, I'm not saying that's like contributing the whole factor to it, to the performance there, but it definitely played a role that he was carved up, feeling good, and he could just go out there and he looks
for sure. So if there's a bit of background noise, there's couple of hot rods floating around Oahu at the moment.
Yeah. For anyone listening or watching, Dojo's been on this world little tour, and he's tuning in front of you, and he's like trying to. kind of freaking me out because I feel like it's going to give this impression that all we do here is just travel around, work with these fighters, work from all over the world like it's one of those Bali Fitfluencers company or something. It's absolutely. Have you seen
Not
this?
quite, not quite. Yeah, no. Just a long connection on the way home, mate.
But
No,
yeah, anyway, let's talk about what we want to go over, and that's Leon's performance. I think that's going to go down as one of the best sporting moments of our generation, I think, and not just in fighting. I think that was one of the craziest upsets, underdog stories, comebacks of the year, just crazy. Like, what an impressive performance. But let's talk about the week that was. Again, we went over there. I was there from the Saturday. You got over a few days later. Our role, again, is just to make sure that these guys are making weight as safely as possible. We're fueling them up. We're doing this in the most scientifically backed way possible. A big philosophy for me nowadays is I know I can make weight with all these guys. Like, I've done it so many times with them. It's how do we get these little 1%ers? So that's what I want to go over. I want to talk about Leon's strategy when it came to making weight, like why it was a bit different in Utah, what were the thinking behind what we did. But Dojo, give us your experience. What did you think when you were over there in Salt Lake City?
Look, I think we said this on the first one, right? Just of how every fight week's going to be different, and then like this was a prime example of that. Like it was almost like a night and day difference to the fight week we had in Dallas a couple of weeks before. This time around, we had like a full kitchen set up. There was like, just that access to all these facilities. We weren't having to run around hotels and find different bits of gear and everything. Like we had everything all in one setup. So it was just really interesting to see how that ran when you do have everything kind of like in one place and how easy it can be to organize that way. And like the contrast between that and then having to do like the makeshift kitchen in the last one. I think for me, it was really cool seeing, especially for Leon as well. Every athlete's different, right? But Leon especially, wow, like just seeing how strict he is with his food and like how like he will he was being like very particular through the week, right, about how he ate everything, and you can just tell that that's something that he kind of carries over from just like years and years of discipline, right? Like he's obviously carries like how he does one thing is kind of like how he does everything, right? Like he must train the same way as well, and that was just really, really impressive to see.
Yeah, Leon's one of those athletes that has just always impressed me by exactly that. How you do one thing is how you do everything. And Leon carries that professionalism in every single aspect of his training and his life. The way that he goes about rest, the way he goes about recovery, the way he goes about his diet, the way he goes about his wrestling, his striking. Every little thing, his attention to detail is just crazy. And he never, ever leaves any stone unturned. It's so, so impressive. Leon's really fun to work with in my point of view because Leon, he cuts a fair bit of weight, but he does it really, really smart and really, really diligently. All up, he only cuts about 17, 18 pounds, including the fight week, which is still a good amount of pounds. It's nearly 20 pounds of body weight. It's a lot. When we're talking in context of, elite level, top level UFC fighters, it's probably more on the smaller to the medium side. But in saying that, that gives us a lot of flexibility. And over the last few camps that I've worked with Leon, we've made weight really, really easy. And we've dropped a lot of weight during the fight week. And when it's come time to actually do the final sweat, it's only ever been, a kilo, maybe even a bit less, or one time it was a little bit more. So for this one, especially with this fight, with everything that was going on and, the type of opponent that we're fighting, that, what we're fighting Kamaru Usman, we are at altitude, which we'll talk about on another podcast, why that's important to consider. We're going to have to really push, like really deep, dig deep in this fight. You're going to have to have all the fuel there so that you can go right until that last second of the fifth round. We knew that going in there. So my game plan when we're talking from a nutrition perspective was, you know what? I want to keep you a little bit heavier during this fight week. I want to make sure that you have more than adequate calories. We're not getting super restrictive when it comes to the carbohydrate. And we're not going to do the traditional, you drop weight every single day and then we just slowly cruise down to the scale. Let's rely on that last little bit of sweat because we are close enough that we can do that. And I want to make sure that you're, again, not depleting going into the biggest fight of your life. you're maintaining, if not fueling up a little bit. So that was our approach with Leon, which looked really different to a lot of other fighters that were on the card. Like you work with any other UFC fighter, you walk around that hotel, they're all depleted, they're all going down. Leon never looked sucked out during like the fight week. He never really looked that fatigued. He never looked down. Like obviously you're not eating as many calories as you are when you're training 2-3 times a day. And that can be a bit of a shock to the body. But he did look pretty good. He was in good spirits, like you said, and he's very particular, very diligent. Every 3-4 hours, we were on those meals, and he was always making sure, even if he was out, that he was back in time for meals, and he was making sure if he was out, like coordinating with me, so he had meals with him. That was a really cool thing, and it was cool, like you said. It really goes to show how every fight week is different. And at that top level, you really have to individualize his approach for these guys. Like again, for Leon, we didn't want to get too restrictive. That was a big part of the game plan. I think anyone that watched that fight, like I think it's hard to argue that altitude did play a big role. And again, like I said, we'll talk about that in another podcast. But the fact that he had enough energy to pull off what he did in that last minute of that fight after going through everything, that to me kind of confirmed, yeah, we made the right call. We made the right call by keeping him a little bit heavier, making sure that we weren't zapping those glycogen stores, because we knew that that was going to be a fight that we had to be able to push all the way to the wire.
Yeah, and talking about pushing to the wire, that was so close. But even talking about high energy and like through the week, like I'm sure most people probably would have seen by now the video that you put out of the boys, like of Leon cutting weight while the boys were all playing footy, like in the gym. And I can tell you, there was a couple of people that I saw around the hotel. I won't name any names, but some of the other fighters that were floating around that looked like skeletons, like a couple of days out. Like it's pretty crazy to see the contrast between what good preparation looks like, even at that top level, right? Like Leon's like walking around looking relatively normal and like able to have an active training session the night before, and like play around with the boys and still be in like good spirits, versus like some of the people you see floating around the hotel that look like they're literally just like doing their best to stay conscious on their feet. Like it's pretty crazy, the contrast.
Yeah, it's crazy, right, man? And I always think about this because at the end of the day, if we wanted to do that with Leon, we absolutely could have. And at the end of the day, he would have made weight. And it's like, again, it's not the game of making weight. It's how you do it and what's the approach. And is there a competitive advantage by doing it this way as opposed to this way? And I firmly believe now, especially after seeing that, like, don't get me wrong, that was a hard fight for Leon. We knew it was always going to be a hard fight. So we had to make sure that there was that fuel in the tank. I'm not sure that if we did deplete him and if we went about like that and made him look like a skeleton by Wednesday, yeah, he would have been super light. He probably would have woken up on weight. Would he have been able to push as hard given all of the other circumstance he was in with the altitude, fighting one of the best wrestlers of all time, best gas tank of all time, knowing he had to go hard for 5 rounds? Would he have been able to do that? I'm not going to say it would have made a huge difference, but it definitely would have played a factor in there. So that's the thing, is I always see these guys walking around these hotels just depleting themselves. Like, yeah, you can make the weight and maybe you might perform okay, but was that your best performance? And then what was all the effect that's going to happen after that? What's happening in the 2 weeks after this fight when you rebound from that and you have to go up again in your weight, and then you have to cut more weight coming down? And then what's the long-term effect of doing this on your health? And I look at guys like Leon, where every day he's eating minimum 6 to 8 meals. He's finishing off every day by eating ice cream. That's not just the night before weigh-ins. That every day of fight week, he was eating ice cream at the end of the day. I look at someone like that and I go, yeah, that's probably going to have a way better chance of having a better performance come fight night. And overall to your health, it's going to be better. Overall for your competitive longevity, that's going to be way better for you.
Yeah. Yeah.
So what I wanted to ask as well, Dojo, is that last little bit, everyone probably has seen that video when we were playing around and Leon was kicking the footy round. What were your thoughts? Like, we've made weight so many different ways, you know, and you've seen both ends. Like, you've seen both ends when guys are really pushing it, and you've got to just, you know, okay, we're doing it as best we can. We're monitoring these guys, but this is not how sport should be. We should not be putting guys through this. We've seen that, and we've seen right up to the other end, like with Leon, where he can throw a footy around, he can put on like a little sauna suit, have a laugh, we can play some music, and he pretty much dance his way to the scales and then put on a performance. What's your thoughts on it? Like seeing from that end, from the extreme to that end, what are your thoughts on it now?
I think like from a practitioner point of view, you all like I feel like anyway, like you want your athlete to kind of be in that position where Leon is, because like just from a practitioner point of view, they don't seem as uncomfortable. Like you don't feel like the athlete is harming themselves by just doing a smaller cut. They're able to still be active, be in good spirits, and not like hating their life. But I think on the flip side of that, it is kind of like a Leon's kind of fortunate to be in the position where he can make that weight relatively easy with his body type. And like obviously someone who maybe if someone was like a little bit taller or longer or something and they carried a bit of extra weight and they to make that same weight they had to cut a little bit extra, and say like they're competing at that level and it's the same stakes involved, and it's just unavoidable. Like even though from a practitioner's perspective it might be more favorable for them to be in that position where Liam was, where he's like feeling not as drained. In some cases, it might just not be realistic to achieve that, even with as much preparation as you want. I think that's like it was cool to see it, for sure. And like obviously now, I think everyone can kind of like understand that you don't have to be that skeleton to get down as low as possible so that you can put on as much weight as possible to get back in and win the fight. Because obviously Leon didn't do that and he's won the fight. So this is a pretty good example of how you don't need to always be cutting that weight. But I think it's always kind of like that balance, right? Of like, what is this person putting at stake? Like, how necessary is it for them to make that weight? And these are all kind of like factors that that come into play when you're making these decisions about how much does this athlete need to cut, how much is going to be safe for them to cut. Yeah, I think like it was really cool to see, but I think it's still it's one of those things, right? Like it's hard to say like which one is better yet at this stage, until I think it's still difficult. Like as I said, from a practitioner point of view, I can see why we would want it there, but then why athletes might want to still go down to these lower weight classes where they're cutting more weight, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I think something that I've been thinking about, and we're actually doing a whole podcast on this topic, is the whole idea of why you do cut so much weight, or the 10% rule. And me and you have spoken about this at length. And I think it's important for people to understand when we're looking at these athletes and you're hearing us talk about, hey, like this guy can cut 10%. I think especially when you look at like our top athletes, when you look at Alexander Volkanovski, you look at Israel Adesanya, and you say, look at Leon Edwards, these guys, they're three great examples like of just how great of anomalies they are compared to the everyday person. And at that elite level sport, that's all it is. These guys are anomalies. If you think of a bell curve, they are probably all the outliers. And I think people often forget that. And especially when it comes to weight category sports, you need to understand that those anomalies or those certain characteristics about that athlete has probably played a huge role in them being able to get to the point that they're at. And I think Israel and Alex, for example, are two great examples. Israel, one of the highest sodium sweat athletes I've ever seen, sweats so much sodium and is a huge sweater in general. That's a hugely favorable characteristic when it comes to weight cutting. Alex Volkanovski used to be 210 pounds or something, and he got the most crazy amount of muscle mass for his frame in terms of compared to other athletes. The percentage of his body mass that is muscle mass compared to the average athlete is insane. Again, that's a characteristic that's hugely favorable to weight cutting. With Leon, he's extremely diligent. He's tall, he's lean, and he's got a big muscle mass, and he can maintain quite a small frame for his weight class by being really tall, and he can diet down really easily. Whereas even if you look at other people like similar frame, they can't do what Leon does because they just don't have the frame that Leon has. That's a hugely favorable characteristic for cutting weight. I think that's an important thing to remember when you're looking at these elite level guys and they're cutting weight and they're doing these crazy numbers. It's because they've probably got a lot of like chips that are stacked in their favor. And when we bring that back and we look at those other athletes and like say younger amateur athletes, you probably don't have that. and you're probably, or maybe you do, but you don't have to figure that out yet, or you don't know about it yet. It's probably best that you don't figure it out. And what I'm getting at here is the reason we know all that, the reason we could do these things with people like Volk and Israel and Leon, and you, when you come in and you see me doing these fight weeks, why they look so dramatically different is because, yes, we're using all the same principles, but it really is such an individual thing. It is such an individual approach when you're at this level, because you have to be aware of what approaches work best for this athlete, what approaches work best for that athlete. If I take out carbs from this athlete, I know that's not a good thing, but I can take them out from this athlete and it's absolutely fine. So having that really highly individual approach is so hugely important. And that's pretty much the concept that I want to get across in this podcast, because over the last 6 weeks, we've been involved in 4 UFC title fights. We had 3 of those athletes take the title and 1 unfortunately didn't get it. So 3 out of 4, not too bad. But again, those 4 athletes, the fight week approaches we took with each of them look so drastically different. Yep. Even though all 4 of those athletes are quite literally at the pinnacle of their sport, we're all using the same principles. We're using the exact same approach for all of them, but the way we go about making weight with each of them was so different and so individualized, because it absolutely had to be to put them in the best position possible to get them the best performance of their night.
Yeah. And I was just going to say as well, one of the chips, I think that that you were talking about, the chips being stacked in people's favor. One of the really important ones at this level, right, is that these guys are doing one thing that we see probably a little bit too often is like maybe like people that haven't been in the sport, or like amateurs trying to replicate these sort of weight cuts and things, and pushing it probably a lot more than they should. And like you said, because these guys are those outliers and they've also had all this experience of doing it, they're able to pull off these maybe like bigger weight cuts, or able to do these things that are more individualized to them, because they've known and they've practiced, they've worked with you for so many years, they know how their body responds to things. Whereas someone who's just coming into the sport as an amateur, or maybe they've been fighting for a little while but not that long, they're not going to know how their body responds super well, and they probably shouldn't be cutting these huge amounts of weight, right? Like I think we were talking about this the other day, that maybe some of the recommendations out there at the moment are possibly even a little bit too high in terms of how much weight people should be or can be cutting during fight week.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm actually going to do a full podcast either tonight or tomorrow about Jack with this, where I really don't like it. I don't like the 8 to 10% recommendation where athletes should be cutting. I think that's such a load of BS. I don't think anyone should be recommending it. I think at that top level, like we just said, there's outliers where, yeah, that applies for, but for the 95% of other people, I don't think it applies to them at all. But anyway, Dojo, I think that's a pretty good recap. That was quite possibly one of the craziest experiences of my professional career. I think that fight week in general, topping it off with the way that the fight went and like just everything that went around that week, was quite possibly one of the most craziest experiences I've ever had. I think it's going to go down in sporting history as one of the best ever moments in sport. Like I've never really seen a response like I've seen with all of our athletes in any sport. And I've worked with some pretty high level guys, not just in MMA and UFC, and very, very other, a lot of other high profile athletes in other sports. I've never seen a response like this with what Leon's getting. And you know what? He deserves every bit of it. He's one of the best guys you'll ever meet. He's worked so hard. He's gone through so many ups and even more downs to get to that point. And I'm so happy for him and his team that they get to experience that and go through that. But by far one of the best and craziest experiences of my professional career.
Yeah. What an incredible weekend. And yeah, amazing finish to it.
All right, Dojo, I think let's wrap that up there, and we'll let you get back to doing whatever you're doing in Honolulu, and then jump back on it when you get back home.
Sounds good. All right, cheers to the call, Jordy. Talk to you again soon.